While you were busy going on dates, building a career, and being generally productive, I was studying the blade. Peerless warriors of honor capable of cutting through solid stone with their glorious Nippon steel swords folded over 1,000 times, or something like that. It's time to learn a little bit more about the famous warrior class of medieval Japan. This is of course the samurai explained, poorly. The history of the Japanese samurai spans such a vast time period with so many major events and cultural and technological developments that to try and cover it all in one video is a fool's errand. Fortunately for you, viewer, I am that fool. We know that the role of the samurai drastically evolved over time, with the term samurai itself originally referring to a specific social class before becoming what we know it as today. But let's begin, as all things begin, at the beginning, and break the history of the samurai out into distinct periods, starting with the origins, 7th to 12th century AD. The samurai class has its roots in the earliest centuries of medieval Japan. During the Nara and Hasuka periods, much of Japan went through political reforms, with the Taiho Code being adopted across the land in 702. This code required for apparently the first time a national census, and further for the first time a national conscription where every 1 in 4 men were required to report for military service and supply their own weapons and arms, in exchange for certain duty and tax exemptions. Kind of like the world's worst tax break, but establishing a clearly defined warrior class within Japanese society at the time. The code also broke the bureaucracy of the land into 12 distinct classes or ranks, with those of the 6th rank and lower being referred to as samurai and being basically just public servants. Military men would not at this time be called samurai for a few centuries. As conflicts and tensions grew across the various provinces of Japan during the Heian period, local lords needed more than untrained peasants who happened to own a spear and told, hey, go kill those guys. They needed trained and dedicated warriors, those whose free time was spent more in martial efforts than farming or other crafts. These early warriors, originally tasked and employed with protecting the land and serving local lords, gradually formed into a warrior aristocracy, with significant power in the kingdom in and of themselves. Turns out being the one with the sword and the know-how to use it can be a powerful motivator to get others to take you seriously. This period of strife introduced iconic Japanese and samurai weapons and armor, with the tachi, the predecessor of the famed katana, the naginata, basically a sword with a really long handle, the oyori and domaru styles of armor, and the yumi or bow. Various skirmishes began to establish these warriors' fighting doctrines, methodologies, tactics, and were instrumental for our next period, the rise of the samurai. The Kamakura period saw the rise of the samurai as a much more powerful and influential class within Japanese society as a whole. As various border conflicts, conquests, and disputes occurred across Japan, with different feudal lords vying for power, the samurai became symbols not only of Japanese military might, but of the ideal citizen and warrior. Highly trained, unbelievably disciplined, and with a variety of skills, the samurai of this period were probably some of the finest and, let's be honest, most badass warriors in the world, as emphasis began being placed on them to train essentially from birth. During the reign of the Kamakura shogunate, a dynasty established when the Minamoto clan defeated the Taira clan in the Genpei War, samurai began to adopt a code of conduct known as Bushido. Bushido, or Way of the Warrior, was supposed to be the bedrock upon which a samurai's morals and life were built. Bushido itself wasn't truly formalized for a couple hundred years during the later Edo period, but Confucian, Zen, and Buddhist philosophies all contributed to its creation and doctrine during the Kamakura period. While each Japanese clan and sect of samurai, is that right? Sect? Group of samurai? Flock? It's gotta be flock. While each flock of samurai interpreted Bushido differently, it generally emphasized the importance of honesty, bravery, frugality, martial arts mastery, honor until death, and ultimately loyalty to the samurai's lord, even again until death. The development and adoption of Bushido was critical in establishing the samurai's position in society and political influence across Japan. As the samurai grew in power, number, and influence, around this time in 1274 AD, the Mongols, not quite content with just owning and conquering China and establishing the Yuan dynasty, set their sights on the islands of Japan. Sending a small invasion force of just 40,000 soldiers and 900 ships, they landed at various locations across the islands. Cue Ghost of Tsushima. After a few battles, the deciding factor in this invasion was the poor weather conditions and rough oceans that constantly battered the Mongolian forces, and the Battle of Torikaigata, where samurai led by Takazaki Tsunaga and reinforced by Shiraishi Michiyasu pushed back the Mongolian armies, resulting in over 3,000 dead Mongolian soldiers and withdrawal back to their ships. The samurai, seizing the advantage, performed many night raids on the Mongolian fleet, and the fleet was eventually forced to retreat to mainland China with its tail between its rudders. From there, the Mongols took a more diplomatic approach to their Japanese relationship and attempted to find a more peaceful resolution by sending multiple emissaries to Japan, who returned without good news, or their heads. After a couple of dozen emissaries returned headless, the Mongols decided negotiations were not going well, and launched one of the most infamous naval invasions in history. In 1281, 7 years after their first failed invasion, the Mongols gathered a force of 140,000 soldiers and 5,000 ships and sailed to the north of Kyushu Island. As the huge army prepared to disembark, a massive typhoon struck the island, wreaking absolute chaos and havoc among Mongolian forces as thousands of ships and soldiers were lost to the seas. With over half their forces almost instantly depleted and panic spreading, the few troops who were actually able to land on the island were quickly met by samurai steel and killed by the defending warriors. Once again, the Mongol forces were forced to retreat in one of the most epically failed naval invasions in history, and the mythology of Japan being a blessed nation by nature itself began to spread among the defenders and the inhabitants. It was also around this time that Masamune, the renowned swordsmith, perfected the art of layering and folding soft steel over hard steel. Not too hard, not too soft.
Not too hard, not too soft.
With multiple layers worked and folded at differing heats to reduce impurities and increase different levels of hardness, these weapons became known for their razor sharpness. While the superiority of Japanese swords over its contemporaries is still highly debated by nerds and weebs online, it's undeniable that this process made the swords renowned across the world. Following the Kamakura period, minor conflicts saw the rise of two ruling powers within Japan: the Ashikaga shogunate in the north and the imperial court in the south, basically splitting the conflicted nation into two. Various emperors ruled each court and unsurprisingly viewed themselves as the legitimate power for all of Japan. As the various clans devoted to one faction or another skirmished and fought for resources and territories, samurai warfare was refined again during this period. Where before small skirmishes would be fought mostly with yumi or bows with hit and run tactics and cavalry, larger blocks of infantry wielding naginata and swords began to become much more common, and close combat tactics and skills became more important. Non-samurai, lower class soldiers called Ashigaru utilized in battles, and samurai distinguished themselves on the battlefield by wearing the iconic kabuto and menyori, which was not only intimidating and protective, but just kind of awesome. However, things took a much deadlier and chaotic turn as we enter our next period, the Warring States period, 15th to 16th century AD. The states don't just war for no reason, so let's set up what happened. In 1467, one Hosokawa Katsumoto, a high official to the shogun, and Yamana Sozin, a regional lord nicknamed the Red Monk, had a relatively minor spat with each other. In the world's deadliest game of dominoes, this small dispute created a chain reaction of events that caused one of the greatest periods of internal strife and civil war in Japanese history. While their initial spat caused the so-called Onin War, it had a much larger effect in devastating Kyoto, the seat of power in the land, and severely weakening the Ashikaga shogunate, creating massive power vacuums and opportunities for those willing to bloody themselves on their climb to the top. Daimyos, or regional lords from all across Japan, began fighting each other, attempting to claim territory, crush adversaries, or solidify their own power. This is known as the Sengoku period and is one of the most represented and defining eras of samurai history, as these warriors, they really came into their own during this time, as they slaughtered each other. Warfare and samurai weapons and even armor changed drastically with the introduction of new tactics on the battlefield. No longer did soldiers fight loosely in skirmishes, but now clashed in pitched, close combat with large, tight spear formations. More Ashigaru than ever were recruited and conscripted, and the combat was so heated and fierce that more traditional weapons, better suited maybe to open combat such as the naginata, fell out of use. The large, long-hilted tachi blades also became unwieldy, and the shorter, lighter, and faster katana became much more common. However, despite anime and popular belief, the katana for samurai, while used in battle, was also more of a status symbol to display their societal position and wealth, and was much more of a sidearm, as yari spears and yumi bows were much more widely used in battles, as it's generally a good idea to keep the enemy's stabby points as far away from you as you possibly can. However, one of the biggest technological upheavals to Japanese warfare during this time was the introduction of matchlock guns from Portugal. Again, despite popular belief that the majority of samurai rejected foreign weapons due to honor and tradition, the reality is that Japanese military minds, as trained and familiar with warfare as anyone in the world really, instantly saw the potential of these powerful additions to their arsenal. Japanese swordsmiths and weapon makers almost instantly made improvements to and mass-produced matchlock weaponry. By the end of the Sengoku period, thousands of guns would be prevalent throughout Japan. The Sengoku period also represented radical shifts in how samurai were treated and honored in Japanese society. Unlike previous periods where a samurai was essentially a member of nobility and requiring to be born into a noble lineage, much like a European knight, warriors who proved themselves in battle or otherwise became notable could attain the rank of samurai and receive any applicable social and monetary benefits. This served as an incentive for those with less opportunity to serve their lord wholeheartedly and with pure devotion, as the prospect of becoming a samurai would have been appealing to many in lower social classes. They were basically told, hey, if you just apply yourself a little bit, you too can get some badass armor. As the warring states warred, there were those who desired a unification of the land underneath one banner and one ruler. Here enters the famous Oda Nobunaga, an esteemed daimyo, brilliant tactician, and political powerhouse in Japan. Nobunaga, using a variety of innovative tactics and lots of guns, paved the way for a path to unification by consolidating power underneath himself and ending certain long-standing practices that tended to draw out conflicts. He made great strides toward a unified Japan before his death in 1582 at the hands of one of his own generals, Kechi Mitsuhide. Nobunaga's loyal followers, including Tokugawa Ieyasu, hunted and eventually killed the traitorous general almost a month after the death of their master. Having secured power in the region, another devoted follower of Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, began looking for external conquests and launched a series of invasions against China by trying to cut through the less defended Korea. As Hideyoshi sent resources and soldiers elsewhere in a very aggressive strategy, Tokugawa Ieyasu chose to use a more turtle-like method, defending and biding his time while his rivals weakened each other. A very classic strategy, and when the time was right, he struck. And after a decisive battle that ended the Tokiyomi clan's rule, Tokugawa Ieyasu began the Tokugawa shogunate period, and finally, in 1615, Japan became unified under one rule. Bringing us to the Edo period, 17th to 19th century. The Tokugawa or Edo period was one of relative peace, especially when compared to the long years of war and bloodshed that came before. With the country unified under a central government and no major warfare occurring across the realm, the role of samurai gradually shifted in the Edo period, with a focus on diplomacy, bureaucracy, and more scholarly pursuits taking place instead of military practices. Many samurai began serving as government officials, administrators, teachers, and instructors in various arts and martial arts. One of the defining characteristics of the Edo period is the lack of really any social mobility, as the Tokugawa government enforced a strict social hierarchy with samurai at the tippy top. The samurai were expected to adhere to the principles of Bushido, and the era saw the codification of Bushido as a formalized ethical system. The iconic paired swords of the samurai, the katana and shorter wakizashi, while still worn, became status symbols in society. Although technically under the law, a samurai could still cut down any commoner who did not show them proper respect at their choosing, historical records disagree on how often this actually occurred. Radical changes brought an end to the Edo period and the fall of the samurai and eventual Mai Restoration in the 19th and 20th century. The relative peace of the Tokugawa era was literally destroyed as the massive US steamships, commandeered by Commodore Matthew Perry, blasted their way into forcing Japan to open their borders to trade and travel. The historically isolationist nation became open, and westernization and modernization became rampant. This is referred to as the Meiji Restoration, as more modern practices of governance, military conscription, and education made the traditional samurai way of life pretty much obsolete. Sad for the samurai, at least. That was a very poorly explained and simplified version of the history of the samurai, but I hope you enjoyed it. It's an endlessly fascinating topic, and I highly recommend you go and do some research of your own to learn more about these famed warriors. If you did learn something new, or you're just feeling bored, subscribe for more poorly thought out, edited, and executed content. Now I need to get back to studying the blade. Poorly.